Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this international live broadcast. My name is Stefan Toxoff. I'm speaking to you from Berlin, Germany. Now, we might just be days away from the outbreak of a new war, and this time in Syria. Syria and also Iran are targets for destruction, regardless of whatever specifics the media would lead you to believe are happening in these nations. Now, any such war at this stage could and would immediately develop into a thermonuclear world war involving the nations of Russia and also China. Now, we will be joined tonight live by Helga Zepp-LaRouche to address this webcast. Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche is chairwoman of the BÜSO Party, Bürgerrechtsbewegung Solidarität, the civil rights movement Solidarity, and she is also the president of the International Schiller Institute. Already back in November, Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche issued a forceful intervention with her international call to action to stop World War III. This call has been translated into at least 11 languages and launched a worldwide mobilization, which has been followed by many actions and statements around the world. But as anyone with a clear mind can see, we are on the edge of a cliff. And the driver for the immediacy of war, the total disintegration of this worldwide financial system, is as present as ever. This is why Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche has decided to appear live tonight before an international audience to outline the steps to not only avert this looming war, but to solve the financial and economic crisis. And obviously, an important aspect of this webcast is to be an international dialogue. So I ask you to send your questions during this webcast to webcast@buso.de, which is webcast@bueso.de. And we will do our very best to address them as they come in. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome and present to you our main speaker tonight, Helga Zepp-LaRouche.
Good evening. Actually, this webcast originally was meant to address primarily a European audience, but because of the urgency of the strategic situation, and since I'm presently nearby Washington, I decided to do this webcast in English. And I'm addressing myself to those of you who recognize that civilization right now is in mortal danger. It should be obvious to any thinking human being on this planet that the continuation of the present policies is possibly leading to the extinction of the human species. And I appeal to you, at least those who agree with me, to join the mobilization, to do everything in your capability to stop this danger of civilizational collapse. Now, it is not true that this catastrophe is inevitable. And in the beginning, before I go into some rather heavy material, I want to say, rule out the idea out of your thinking that one cannot do anything anyway. This sentence, which is the most spoken sentence in Germany, man kann ja sowieso nichts machen, one cannot do anything anyway. I don't want to address this situation from that standpoint. There are solutions, and they can be implemented in time, but it requires a very drastic and dramatic fundamental change of the system, of the global financial order, and an equally dramatic change in the thinking of most people. Now, we are confronted right now with two immediate crises. One is the immediate collapse of the transatlantic financial system, which is already leading to the collapse and the breakup of the euro, as we can see most clearly in the situation in Greece. But if Greece leaves the euro, which it will have to, it has no other choice, this will mean the breakup of the euro and, in all likelihood, the entire EU. Secondly, we have the immediate danger of a thermonuclear war triggered by the events around Syria and Iran, but not really focused on these two countries, but actually aiming at the regime change or destruction, disintegration of Russia and China. Obviously, what I'm saying here is not what you read in Bild-Zeitung or what you listen to in other mass media. But I can assure you, I would not say these things lightly. I'm trying to address the reality of the situation as it is, because only if you look at it in the most rational and most unblocked fashion can you find the necessary remedy. The name of the game is empire, or more precisely, British Empire. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who say, what, British Empire? It ceased to exist since a long time. But if you understand that the empire, which has been dominating the European and actually global situation for almost 4,000 years, has a tendency to come back in ever new clothes, in new shapes and forms like a slime mold. And this time it has another name called globalization. If you understand under British Empire the complex system of central banks, investment banks, hedge funds, private equity funds, insurance companies, the shadow banking, then you know what I mean by British Empire. It is that financial system which has been responsible for the paradigm shift in the last 40 to 45 years, shifting away from the production of physical goods, the so-called real economy, more and more to speculation, to the idea of profit maximization and pure monetarism. As long as the Soviet Union existed, that system of globalization had certain constraints because the Soviet Union existed as a second superpower. But when the Warsaw Pact started to disintegrate between 89 and 91, the world had reached a turning point. With the communist system gone, there would have been the chance for a new peace order of the 21st century. There was no more enemy, and one could have used the economic and scientific resources of the entire world to go for the solution of those urgent tasks of mankind, which were then there and they still are, namely the elimination of hunger, the development of the underdeveloped sector, joint scientific breakthroughs to reach the next level of mankind's development. Instead, rather than the United States recognizing the chance to go back and reconfirm the principles of the American Revolution, which had made America to be a temple of liberty and a beacon of freedom, unfortunately, with the Bush senior administration, the neocons appeared and declared the New American Century Doctrine, which was the idea to run the world as an empire based on the Anglo-American special relationship. Now, we, from the international LaRouche movement, we had a plan, which was the productive triangle and later the Eurasian land bridge, which would have been the basis for such a peace order, which, however, for reasons which I shortly will mention, was rejected. At that time, the policy of regime change was adopted in every country which would not be willing to submit to this empire. Now, the first expression of such regime change was the first Gulf War, which started in August 1990, which was called Operation Desert Storm, which had the explicit goal to bomb Iraq back into the Stone Age, and it did. The policy this policy was interrupted between 1992 and 2000 in the 8 years of the Clinton administration, but it remained in the background in the form of the clean break policy, which was the idea of having regime change of every country not friendly to Israel, which was around even during the Clinton years, and as a clear response to the efforts of President Clinton to have peace in the Middle East through the Oslo Accords. It was adopted by the Netanyahu government then. And it came fully back with the Bush and Cheney administration and all the time being pursued by the British government. Now, with George W. Bush Jr., who declared these countries to be the axis of evil, the next target was the Second Iraq War, which, as we now know, was based completely on lies, developed through MI5 and Tony Blair, and that was then the basis for the speech Colin Powell gave in the United Nations, which he later called to be the worst mistake he ever made in his life. Now, this was behind the war of aggression against Libya and the assassination of Gaddafi, because at that point the forces pushing these regime changes could not wait to put Gaddafi on trial, because they already had in mind a continuation of this campaign against Syria and Iran. A trial would have been too long, and Gaddafi may have told some very unpleasant details about his dealings with his previous collaborators. Now, this campaign is reaching Syria and Iran, and it has almost nothing to do with these countries, but it is aimed at Russia and China. And when you hear the stories about Syria and about Iran, you should have a déjà vu experience. It's the same accusations against Iran, what we heard about Iraq, and the recent report of the International Atomic Energy Agency that Iran would have the nuclear bomb maybe in 1 year, or be able to put its facility underground so that they would not be reachable anymore, is in complete contradiction to the US National Intelligence estimate from October 2011, where they confirmed the findings of the report's evaluation from 2007 that Iran had stopped its military nuclear program in 2003. And as many people also observed, the entire information the International Atomic Energy Agency used came from Western intelligence sources, and the former head of this agency, Hans Blix, also said that there was absolutely no new information given. So this war has already begun. NBC News just a couple of days ago reported that the Israeli Mossad has been recruiting and training members of the MEK, the Mujahedin-e-Khalq organization, which still, I believe, is on the terrorist list of the State Department, training them for assassinations and bombings inside Iran. This was confirmed by officials of the Obama administration and restated in an interview by Mohammad Larijani, who is the brother of the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Ali Larijani, who reported to NBC that Iranian officials caught MEK members attempting to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists, and Larijani then proposed that the United States should bring Israel before the UN Security Council for state-sponsored terrorism, in line with its still ongoing policy of a war against terrorism. Now remember that there were in the last 2 years several explosions in Iranian nuclear facilities, and 4 nuclear scientists have been assassinated according to the same MO in the last 2 years. The Russian Foreign Ministry was very concerned about reports that, according to the Israeli website Debka File, which was then later confirmed by the Institute for Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences, that British and Qatari special forces are operating in Syria. And the Russian government said very clearly that they are very concerned about the violation of Syrian sovereignty by these acts. And that these mercenaries from Qatar, Great Britain, and possibly Saudi Arabia are there to provide ammunition to the rebels in Homs in large quantities. Now, since the last months of the last year, there has been a gigantic build-up of military forces in the Gulf, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Eastern Mediterranean. There are 2 aircraft carriers in the Gulf region, and the third will arrive there in March, together with a lot of frigates, destroyers, cruise missiles, and each of these aircraft carriers can launch hundreds of combat aircrafts. there are 8 or more Ohio submarines, each with 24 Trident missiles, out of which each has 6 to 8 100-kiloton nuclear warheads. Each sub, therefore, has a destruction power of 1,476 times the kilotons which were detonated in Hiroshima. And you have to add a certain number of British, Israeli, Canadian, French warships to that. Please first map. So if you look at it, the total firepower which is amassed in this region is in absolutely no relation to the supposed reason, namely, the helping the rebels in Syria or, deterring Iran from a nuclear program. But it is clearly aimed for something else. The US Defense Secretary Panetta has talked about the high probability of Israel attacking Iran between April and June. And sources recently have pointed to a more likely date of April or even earlier. And there are rumors about an attack on Damascus even earlier than that. Now, the Iranian government, through their ambassador to the United Nations, has pointed to the right of Iran to defend itself and that it has the capability to do so. Now, also, since November, in Israel, a fierce debate has broken out where former members or former heads of the Mossad or the Shin Bet and even former Joint Chiefs of Staff have come out and warned that if it would come to such an attack, it not only would put Israel in jeopardy, but it would put the entire region for 100 years into complete chaos and destruction. Now, from the best of my knowledge, from having surveyed the situation, of having access to many informed circles around the world, the Iran war is right now on. It's supposed to occur. And by the very logic of the situation, it will not be limited to the region. Once it starts, there is the absolute danger that it will be global thermonuclear war. Now, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov declared in this context that an attack on Iran would lead to a chain reaction which would destabilize the whole world, have grave consequences, and nobody would know where it would end. Now, it is, I think, worse than that, because it is the logic of the weapons being here is accumulated. You don't start such a war with one nuclear weapon, then wait until retaliation comes, and then maybe have a second one. But it is very clear that we are looking at mutual assured destruction, which was the official NATO doctrine in the time when the Warsaw Pact still existed. Now, one element of this is that thermonuclear weapons are so horrible that you normally, if you are a normal human being, you would think nobody will ever use them because they lead to the extinction of civilization. Now, therefore, the danger is that whoever plans this war would go to launch the entire arsenal by surprise and basically, to be then the only dominant power. Now, every military expert in Europe or analyst of the Middle East knows and tell you in private discussions that a war against Iran is the equivalent of World War III. And since this is generally known, well, may there be the element of winning the war by a horrible bluff? Now, the idea of a thermonuclear chicken game, remember the chicken game was this experiment they made many decades ago in California, where you have two cars driving towards each other with full speed, and then the one who lost the nerve would, try to escape the clash in the last moment, which obviously is already not very sane. But to do this with nuclear weapons is the height of complete criminality and insanity. Now, it is so insane that it risks the extinction of the human species. If you look at how many military ships and missiles and so forth are accumulated there, how quickly could an accident trigger this? How quickly could you have a Gulf of Tonkin incident which would detonate the whole thing? Now, in retrospect, one can say that the Truman throwing the bombs of, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where there was no need to do that, because the Japanese had already surrendered. There were already negotiations involving the Vatican, so there was no need to throw these bombs. But they were thrown in order to demonstrate the principle of Schrecklichkeit. The principle that, there is a weapon now so horrible that in face of this weapon, nobody will ever be tempted to use it. And it was clearly as a preparation for those who thought maybe after World War II, we will have World War III. And remember the famous statement by Bertrand Russell from 1946, where he proposed a preemptive nuclear war against the Soviet Union at that time. Now, therefore, the implicit option here is a bluff to say, okay, surrender. If not, we go for thermonuclear global warfare. And it is the forces of the British Empire which are behind it. And again, for a normal human being, very difficult to conceptualize. But there are people who would like to reduce the world population from presently 7 billion to 1 billion people. I mean, Prince Philip has said it many, many times. Others have said it. And it can be documented that such policies exist. Map 2, please. Now, if you look at this present build-up, it is very clear that we are not only talking about Syria and Iran, but Russia and China. Because Russia has for a long time made the point that the European missile defense system, which has been installed or is being installed in Poland, Czechia, and plans are made for Romania, that they regard this as part of the NATO enlargement towards the east, the encirclement of Russia. Everybody knows that these so-called defensive missile systems can be very quickly turned into offensive systems, and then these missiles could reach Moscow in less than 3 minutes. The Russian chief of staff, Makarenko, a couple of months ago already warned that there is, because of this system, the danger of a European nuclear war, which could go completely out of control. Now, President Medvedev, in response to President Obama's decision to go ahead with this policy of Bush and Cheney, activated recently the radar systems in Kaliningrad. China came to the same interpretation when Obama shifted his emphasis to the Pacific, building new bases and troops in Australia, Philippines, building new military alliances, that it is really aimed at the encirclement of China. And regime change for Russia and China are on the agenda. For this, you have presently mobilized the same network which is responsible for the Orange Revolution against Ukraine, the Rose Revolution against Georgia, and they are now calling for a white or snow revolution in Moscow. It's the Project Democracy Crowd, the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, the IRI, the International Republican Institute, the Soros Operation, and this whole crowd. It's part of this apparatus is unfortunately the new ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, which in German you could say the Nomen est Omen, fast foul, that is responsible for the NDI since 1990, where he worked for the NDI in Moscow. and who has privately been bragging that he was responsible for the, quote, engineering of the re-election of Boris Yeltsin in 1996, because it was his networks of the NDI which maneuvered somehow to get Yeltsin, who was completely hated by the Russian population at that time, because they correctly blamed him of having sold out Russia to the oligarchs and to the West, and managed somehow his re-election. Now, this apparatus is since September of last year fully mobilized in a campaign to claim that the parliamentarian and presidential election in Russia would be fraudulent. Regime change is also on the agenda for China. Mr. McCain in Munich at the Security Conference called for an Arab Spring in Beijing, which was a clear provocation against the Chinese representative at that conference. Now, this has been the policy of the empire faction since 1990. So it has been in place for a long time. You can see here the countries which have been targeted for such regime change. But it is now becoming, from the standpoint of the empire, super urgent, because the transatlantic region is collapsing. While you have relative growth in Asia, China has a growth rate of 8 to 10%, India 7 to 8%, and others similar. Europe and the United States are collapsing. There was an article in People's Daily in the Russian language which said that both Russia and China have recognized that since Putin made the announcement that he plans to return to the presidency, or that he will be a candidate for that the targeting of Russia and China has been put on the agenda, and that therefore these two countries have now built a very strong military alliance against these threats. Now, even before the present escalation, Russia and China had focused on a very advanced scientific and technological orientation, high investments in higher energy flux densities, fourth generation of the inherently safe nuclear energy, the development of the Arctic region, and generally focusing on the new frontiers of science. Russia wants to build the city of Umka, a doomed city in the Russian Arctic for 5,000 residents, which should have full research capabilities, which would be self-sufficient in respect to food production, and it would be modeled on a fictional moon city or an isolated space station. It's planned to be under a dome of 1.2 kilometer long size and 800 meter wide. And it would only cost, by the way, $6 to $8 billion, so peanuts in the present world of bailout packages. And President Putin has made remarkable speeches and written articles that he recognizes that the key problem of the world right now is the bubble economy, and that he is in favor of a system focusing on the production in the real economy. Now, also manned space travel is on the agenda between Russia and China. China has declared that they want to become the leading space power somewhere in the early part of this century. They want to mine helium-3 on the moon, which will be very important for thermonuclear fusion power. And in general, you can see that Asia is relatively prospering while the transatlantic region is collapsing. Now, I have to say this very clearly. The British Empire, defined as I did earlier, rather goes for World War III than leaving the Asian powers to become the leading nations on the planet. And, this despite the fact that, the euro has been proven to be a complete failure, as you can see nowhere more clearly than in the case of Greece, which is right now at the complete point of explosion. As we are speaking here, or as I'm speaking here, the leading trade unions in Greece have called for a popular uprising against the deal imposed on Greece by the infamous Troika. The police trade union has advocated the arrest of the members of the Troika, demanding an immediate arrest order, and somebody who has a sense of humor in a leaflet offered €1 for the arrest of the Troika, expressing how much value they give to these people. Now, the population is in complete despair. And if you look at the situation in Greece, I want to give you some figures, because what this present EU policy has done to Greece, which is, after all, the cradle of European civilization, the birthplace of democracy, and more important, of the Solon's idea of the purpose of mankind being progression, as Schiller described it. This country is now totally destroyed, and people are really desperate. The 27.7% of the Greek population is below poverty levels. That is 3 out of 10 million. That was in 2010, and 2011 became much worse. Children up to 17 years are in poverty, 28.7%. And Greece now is on the level of Latvia, Hungary, Lithuania, and Poland. Unemployment is now, in November 2011, 20.9%. This is a 48% increase over 2010. Youth unemployment is now 48%. That means every second youth is unemployed. And 50% of the trained engineers are out of work. Now, that's maybe the biggest crime, because these are the people who could start to rebuild the Greek economy. And the debt, since the bailout packages have started, has increased the percentage of the Greek debt to GDP from 120 to 159%. Now, Greek parents increasingly have to abandon their children to SOS children villages because they can't feed them anymore. This is the first time this is happening in Europe. It used to be only the case in Africa and other poor areas. And on top of that, the EU Troika wants to have 150,000 people more cut from the civil service on top of 200,000 already. They want to cut pharmaceutical deliveries from 2.5 billion by 1 billion. Now, that means increasing the death rate. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. And they are trying to reduce the minimum wage from 740 euro by another 22%, and for the youth by another 32%. And at the same time, they increase the taxes, 250% increase in property taxes, even for people who have just a tiny little house, and 23% of the VAT tax. So this is the reason why the Greek population is exploding, and they say we cannot continue. Now, obviously, if Greece leaves the euro, it will, in all likelihood, lead to a breakup of the entire eurozone. And that will affect the US banks. In effect, it will probably bring down the entire world financial system. The only reason why this is not happening already is because the Federal Reserve and the EZB are printing money like the Reichsbank did in 1923, which obviously is a very short-lived policy. And some cynics are even saying printing money and causing hyperinflation is the only way how you can reduce the state debt. It's also the most brutal form of expropriation of the population. Now, interestingly, Andreas Voskuhle, who is the president of the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe, warned in a recent speech that the effort to save the euro and to go for more European integration is threatening the loss of democracy in Europe. Now, while this is obviously a complete understatement, but for somebody in his position, this is quite an admission. Now, the only way how one could get out of this disaster is to admit that the euro was a failed experiment. It could not function because the reason from the beginning was the intention to turn Europe into a subdivision of this same British Empire. If you think back for a moment to 1889, which was, after all, the great historical chance of Europe, Thatcher, Mitterrand, and Bush Sr. Forced Germany at the time to give up the D-Mark as the price for unification. Thatcher launched this incredible Fourth Reich campaign. Attali, the advisor of Mitterrand, reports that Mitterrand even threatened to go to war against Germany. And the Bush administration preferred containment through self-containment by putting Germany into the straitjacket of the EU, which they then implemented through the EU treaties from Maastricht to Lisbon. The people were never asked. Referendums in France and Holland were lost, but the rest of the people were never consulted if they wanted this policy. Now, if you look at this Euro experiment, what was the propaganda of its proponents? It should guarantee peace forever in Europe. Well, the reality is never has been so much hatred among the different nations directed against Germany, directed against Greek people, directed against the EU since 1945. Another such lie was strengthening the European position in light of the emerging countries. Now, the disunity being displayed by Europe right now has made Europe the laughingstock of the rest of the world. Strengthening economic powers in Europe. Well, why is Merkel then going as a beggar to the Chinese, asking them to bail out the euro, which the Chinese are obviously too smart to do? Now, Lothar Rühl, the former defense secretary, state secretary, recently wrote in the FAZ that there are new challenges for the European security and defense policy, next map, that basically after the US is now focusing more on the Pacific, that after the Arab Spring, the European responsibility is more for the West. That given the fact that Islamic fundamentalists would still be a great challenge in the war on terror, Europe should focus on the east and south of Libya region, Chad, Sudan, Somalia, the Horn of Africa, the Arab Sea, and in light of this nice policy, the EU just decided to use more drones against refugees from Africa trying to cross the Mediterranean. Now, what this European security and defense policy calls for is expedition corps for interventions, weapons deployable from far, renaissance means air and marine control, strategic troop transport for longer distances over sea and by air, airborne landing capabilities, and so forth and so on. Now, all of this was already in the Lisbon Treaty, which is why we opposed it, among other things, at the time. This policy makes very clear, if you needed one more proof, that Europe is just the regional expression of this global empire. Now, in this present constellation, Europe is making itself the target in a possible war. Now, the newly appointed Russian Deputy Minister Dmitry Rogozin recently warned that basically the problem is that NATO continues to live by the principles set down by NATO Secretary General Lord Ismay, which is keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. Now, that people in Germany should better think about. And then he warned that the present European missile defense system, that, for example, people in Romania may think it helps them, but in reality, with this policy, the Europeans have become the hostages and targets of a retaliatory attack in case of such a war. Now, therefore, the situation we are facing is similar to that which existed with the middle-range missiles at the beginning of the 80s when the Pershing II and the SS-20 were deployed, where the reality of the German security situation was that Germany, in case of war, would get one strike from one side and then a second strike from the other and have absolutely no chance for survival. And that is what we are looking at today again. Now, when you look at this insane situation, well, there is a remedy. We have to use the breakup of the euro as a chance. When the collapse of the communist system occurred in '89, it was a tremendous chance to go for a new peace order for the world. Now we experience the second collapse of a system. And this time we must learn the lessons of '89 and not fall in the trap of just perpetuating a system which is already completely bankrupt. Now what we have to do is we have to help Greece to go back to the drachma. The other European nations should adopt D-mark, franc, and so forth. We must have sovereignty over our currency and our economy. We must cancel all European Union treaties from Maastricht to Lisbon and go back to the sovereign control of our nations as republics. Now, this does not mean that we are anti-Europe, not at all. We are more for Europe than the present EU bureaucrats who are obviously not caring about the people of Europe in the slightest, neither the Greek nor the Germans nor the Italians. And we have to go to a policy of an alliance of fatherlands in the tradition of de Gaulle. And we should just do what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in the 30s to lead America out of the Depression. Implement immediately Glass-Steagall in the tradition of Roosevelt without any changes. Cancel the fictitious debt, which is approximately, nobody knows exactly because of the shadow banking aspect, but it's probably in the vicinity of $1.5 quadrillion or euro, which is the extent of the entire derivative market, and then go for a credit system as it was established by the first Secretary of Finance in the United States, Alexander Hamilton. Issue credit for future production in accordance with scientific principles given by the physical economy. Investments financed with such a credit must be to increase the energy flex density and go for the next level of breakthrough in scientific and technological breakthroughs. And which steps these have to be, that is absolutely scientifically knowable. I speak to that shortly. Then we have to establish fixed exchange rates, go for a new Bretton Woods system, a credit system among many nations over the next 50 to 100 years. Now, what does it require to do this? As a first step, we have to recognize that Europe, in the context of the present EU, is an oligarchical empire. And we have to reject the idea of oligarchism. We have to recognize that the oligarchical model, which was described very well by Friedrich Schiller in his writing about the laws of Lykurg and Solon, where Sparta was run by a small oligarchical elite and they kept the masses of people deliberately stupid, where they had the right to cull the herd, so to speak, whenever they became too many, and allowing the use of Sparta, for example, to shoot the helots, that system has to go forever. Now, people may not recognize it, but the reality is that the world has been living under an oligarchical imperial structure for the last 4,000 years. You first had, at some point, the Persian Empire, when Greece had won over that Persian empire, they could have turned the Attic Sea Alliance into an alliance of equal partners, but they decided to become an empire instead. This was described by Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War. This was then followed by the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Crusades, which were wars on behalf of the Venice banking system, and the British Empire, which exists in 1763 in various forms until today, in the form of globalization and the Anglo-American special relationship. Now, I know people will get upset and say, Europe, the EU, an empire. Well, why do people then say, you can't do anything anyway? What does that say about the system you are living under if that is what you think? Obviously, it is an oligarchical dictatorship which does not give the individual the possibility of intervention. Why do you think it is that the European governments and the G20 governments, since 4.5 years, since the outbreak of the present global financial crisis in July 2007, have done almost nothing to rein in a totally deregulated financial system? Why have people, heads of government, become nothing but the mouthpieces of this financial oligarchical order? Now, the oligarchy, which will be shown in the future, will turn out to have been nothing than a meander in evolution, an aberration, a dysplasia. Now, the oligarchical model assumes a universe which does not exist. It is based on the idea that the second law of thermodynamics is valid. It's based on the ideas of the Club of Rome, with their infamous idea of limits to growth, that the world is a closed system and that we have somehow reached an equilibrium with finite resources, and that therefore population growth in this closed system is the biggest threat to the privileges of the ruling elite. Now, that was clearly expressed by Kissinger in his infamous NSM 200 document already in 1974. It happens to be also the ideology of the Nazis with their idea of Lebensraum, because after all the planet is finite. It is the very core of the idea of British geopolitics, which led Mackinder and Milner at the end of the turn to the 20th century to develop this crazy idea that whoever controls the Eurasian heartland is controlling the globe. It was what led to World War I, and it is now threatening to lead to World War III. The oligarchical model is associated with monetarism, with the idea of maximization of profit for the power elite, the impoverization of masses of population, and it is behind keeping that privilege through the bailout packages since 2007. It is also related to the idea of an intrinsic value of money. Money? Well, money, the present volume of money out there, all you have to do is push the delete button of your computer and it all goes. Or, if the Fed and the EZB are continuing to print money as they are doing right now, it will also evaporate, and you soon can have wallpaper with 1 trillion notes of dollars and euro, as it was in 1923 in Germany. The oligarchical model is also associated with greenism, environmentalism, people who put beetles above human beings. It's associated with Mother Nature, the idea of Gaia, the cyclical ever return of the same. It's the idea of a universe in the tradition of Nietzsche, that only out of the destruction the good new can come. Ideas of Schumpeter, which are right now determining the entire economic policy of the EU. And the idea of conservation of limited resources, saving, sparen, keep the world as an equilibrium. It's absurd, but it's being peddled by the media, by the governments, by the anthropocenic climate change crowd, by the hedge funds who make big profit through that. And it is completely wacky. It is not the universe in which we are living in. The universe is creative. The universe develops in an anti-entropic way. And my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and his basement crew have made recent breakthroughs by investigating more closely the recent 500 million years of the assumed 13.7 billion years of the existence of the universe, that basically in this period you had 5 extinctions, and the last 2 major ones, the so-called PT and KT extinction, were really revealing that, these studies made clear that there were not really great kills, killing up to 96% of all living species at that time, but that only those organisms survived who were ready to increase the energy flux density, which is the principle of the universe at large. And that proves, these 500 million last years prove beyond any doubt that the second law of thermodynamics is not valid in the universe at large. Now, is our planet part of this universe, or is our planet somehow outside of the universe? No, obviously not. Since the existence of mankind, which is approximately 7 million years ago, which in a large scale is 1 minute before midnight, since that period, human creativity has become the driving force in the development of this development. The law of the universe very clearly is anti-entropy, and the increase of energy flux densities has been proven over hundreds of millions of years to be the genetic law of evolution. The development from the inorganic to the biological to human creativity, a distinction which was first recognized by the great thinker Nicolaus of Cusa already in the 15th century, and which was continued, developed by Vernadsky and his notion of the noosphere, has the correct idea that we are dealing with an increase of the energy of the system. Now, Lyndon LaRouche developed this notion of the relative potential population density as a reflection of this law of the universe almost 50 years ago. It is also true for the development of the species on the planet, that on each level of development the resources are relatively limited, and either the species becomes intelligent enough to reach the next higher level of energy flux density, or it goes under. This is why the dinosaurs went under, and why the super large mammals like the mammoth also didn't make it. Now, the oligarchs today are such a species. One can debate if they are dinosaurs or mammoths. In any case, their mental metabolism is such that the amount of consumption in the form of primitive accumulation in relation to their intelligence of their mind is not effective. Like the mammoths, they will end as a dead end, as a blind alley of evolution, and they will disappear. The only danger is that they will take the human race with it. Now the question therefore is, are there enough intelligent people on this planet who act on the basis of this recognition that civilization is about to crash against the wall, and are willing to change it? Can we willfully go to the next level of development, of evolution, if you so will, rather than staying in the realm of the so-called equilibrium, limited sources, geopolitical wars, thermonuclear destruction, and the extinction of civilization? Are we ready to the next jump in evolution, which means the next level of your energy flux density thermonuclear fusion, go for a crash program to have matter-antimatter reaction, manned space travel to the moon and Mars as a mission. Are we able to deal together with the galactic threats which are clearly influencing our planet through changes in the weather patterns, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and so forth? Now, the astronauts and cosmonauts who came back recently from the ISS space station, in their press conference basically said that the dinosaurs made the mistake not putting their DNA on other planets, and therefore they could not survive these similar challenges. Now, the key is to recognize that the second law of thermodynamics is a fraud. The universe is not running down and tending towards an increasing disorder, but contrary, there is a tendency of increasing anti-entropy. The evolution does not occur from below, like Darwin had tried to argue. It's not the survival of the fittest. It is from above. It's what both Nikolaus of Kues and Vernadsky recognized, that it is the higher species which rips above the lower one, pulls it upward. Now, since the existence of the human species, the human mind is the highest element in the universe, at least for now, until we may discover other life in this universe, which could exist, but we don't know. Now, the human species is the one, therefore, up to now, which willfully can cause a jump in its evolution. It's what Friedrich Schiller already wrote as a little diagram. What the plant is, you, human being, be willfully. And that he could say before one really knew about photosynthesis. Now, an old friend of us, Kraft Erika, who in the Apollo program was responsible for the development of the Centaur rocket and the Atlas rocket, made a beautiful comment by saying, the world is finite only to those who are slaves of the pessimistic zero-growth ideology. It's infinite for those who adopt the extraterrestrial imperative. Now, he also developed the beautiful idea that space colonization is the next necessary step of evolution. That life in this evolution developed through photosynthesis from the oceans to the land, then developed higher flux density levels by infrastructure, by new inventions, redefining what the source of energy was. And this based on the necessity to always outpace the effect of attrition if one stays on the same level in production and consumption, or the effect of the evolutionary process that basically has led again and again to the extinction of species in the past, of species who did not contribute to the rising requirements for energy throughput in the biosphere as a whole. Kraft Erika already many decades ago defined the industrialization of the moon and the colonization of Mars as the goal. And I can fully endorse that, because that subsumes virtually all necessary breakthroughs in the realm of science and culture, which we need to master if we want to have a continued existence of civilization. It requires the nuclear fusion propulsion for the travel to Mars, because you don't want to spend 9 months with unbelievable effects on the bodies of the astronaut, but with thermonuclear fusion propulsion, you could reduce that to a couple of days or weeks at most. So therefore, the going to Mars must be a commitment we make now, even if it takes maybe 3 or even 4 generations before we actually can start about building new cities on Mars. It determines the directionality where we want to go. It determines the investments in what industrial inventions or investments we must have, which higher flux density technologies must be applied. And this obviously is only possible through a credit system and not through remaining in a monetary system. Now, this increase of energy flux density must become the yardstick if an investment in industry is good or bad. Now, the former Russian academician Pobyesk Kuznetsov, when he encountered the theory of Mr. LaRouche of the relative potential population density, was very happy, and he said, well, given the fact that great inventions often carry the name of their author, like Watt, Ampere, that he said that Mr. LaRouche will be recognized for his invention of the relative potential population density as the La. So that will be known in the future as the La. Now, the extraterrestrial imperative Kraft-Ericke has been talking about must be and will be the next step of evolution. Now, we are faced with a possible extinction either through thermonuclear war or a dark age because of the disintegration of the financial system. Now, the question is, can we change and choose the alternative? Now, we can go this way by turning Europe again into an alliance of sovereign nations, of sovereign republics. Why do we not, together with Russia, China, India, the United States, and other nations, go for the common aims of mankind? While we have them, the building of the World Land Bridge, the development of the Arctic as the new frontier of science, building Navapa, going for the Bering Strait, building Transaqua and other infrastructure projects for Africa, go for space colonization. Well, why don't we just do that? Doesn't it make more sense than to destroy ourselves through nuclear war? Now, Kraft-Ericke, who was a good friend of ours, also made another point which I want to emphasize. He said that science and technological progress always must be combined with classical culture, with the aesthetical education of man. Because if a science or a technology is good or bad, that is not defined by the technology, but it is defined by man if he is of evil or if he is for the good. Now, an aesthetically educated man in the tradition of the great German classical period of Schiller, of Beethoven, of Dante, and many other towering figures would never use technologies for a bad aim. So the problem is not science and technology, it is the lack of the cultural development of human beings. Now, I'm convinced that while we look at the possible extinction of civilization, that if we get our act together now, we could also be the authors of a new era of mankind. That we could build a true renaissance where we leave oligarchism as a childhood disease behind us, never to come back. Why don't we go for that?